talking about film techniques. These are things that you should be thinking about as you're putting your documentary together, because it's not just about giving us information, but it's also about convincing us that you're worth listening to, and kind of drawing us into the experience of watching your film so that we're not distracted uh, by some mistakes that you might make otherwise. Remember that these are required notes. I will be checking them, and you should be aware of the date that I'll be checking them at this point. So how can this help, especially concerning your grade? If you think about what I've shared with you, you'll know that one of the things that you have to show that you've learned in this unit is that you've learned to manipulate what people see, hear, and read in order to organize an effective argument. And so most of the notes that I'm about to give you will cover, in terms of a documentary video, what people will be seeing, what they will be hearing, and what they will be reading. I'll also talk a little bit about the organizational part, and hopefully it won't take too terribly long. So let's start with what people see in documentary films. Obviously, it's a film, so it's really important that you think about what people are going to be looking at, and the quality of what they're going to be looking at is also going to be important. So making sure that you pay attention to that quality. So there are three things that you can consider when thinking about the quality of what people are looking at. The first is primary footage, and primary footage is stuff that you shoot personally. So you go out and you find the thing that you're looking for, and you use your camera, and you put it on the camera in a way that's you think is going to be effective for you. So those would be things like specific locations, if there are relevant locations to your topic, interviews that you might do with people, and also some people will do reenactments, and all of that is stuff that you would need to create for yourself. I do need to tell you that 80% of your video, of your documentary, needs to be primary footage. You're not allowed to just take a whole bunch of other types of footage, which I'll talk about in a second, and plop it in there as your own. So 80% of your video needs to be primary footage. The other type of footage that we're going to go over is archival footage. So that's footage that already exists, that you're using, hopefully with permission, or it should always be with permission, to help set up what you're trying to do. So you should be concerned with the quality of archival footage. You don't just want to take anything off of YouTube, but you could think in terms of newsreels, home videos if they're appropriate. You don't just want to slap a home video in there, but maybe there's something that emphasizes what you're trying to say. And then, of course, other things used by permission. You may find that using small chunks of things might be helpful, but you do need to keep in mind that you can only use up to 20% archival footage. And so that if you're making a 5 to 7 minute video, is only going to be about a minute, a little over a minute of your footage can be archival. The third thing that you can include in terms of what we're looking at are still images. So when you need to use a photograph instead of a shot. The danger with photographs is that they look really boring. When we're expecting to see a movie, we expect to see things moving. So I would recommend, if you're going to use still images, that you pan over or you move slightly, or you can also zoom in on certain things slowly to make it feel like we're moving as we're watching your video. Second thing we need to talk about is what people are going to hear in documentary films. And a lot of times my experience is that people don't think enough about the quality of the sound in their videos, and you really need to consider that. So here are 4 things that you should think about in terms of what people are going to hear in your film. First of all, dialogue. When you have 2 or more people speaking to each other, You should, you may have an occasion where you do an interview or you're staging two people talking to each other. Make sure that we can hear both people in that case. So dialogue can be scripted or unscripted. You might want to write a little skit that might help. Or, like I said, it could just be an interview where you're asking somebody questions, but again, make sure that we can hear. The second type of thing that we might hear is narration. So narration is just one person describing the important aspects of the topic. When you need to explain something to us, probably the best way to do that is through narration. And oops, that came up too early. Sorry, let's take that off for just a second. Make sure that your narration should almost always be scripted. And you usually want to record that separate, and lay it over the footage that you're using. The third thing, and the arrow came out of order, but the third thing is diegetic sound. So diegetic sounds are sounds that come directly from the location that's being shown. Sounds of, if you're showing a forest, sounds of the forest, or if you're showing a school hallway, it's that rumble of the school hallway. What you want to be careful with diegetic sounds is they can really make your video come to life, but they can also really be distracting, especially if we're trying to listen to somebody speak and all of a sudden we're hearing the echoes of a hallway behind us. That gets really distracting. So you need to think about your diegetic sounds as well as non-diegetic sounds, which are sounds that you add later. Those can be things like music, sound effects, if they're needed. And those can especially be used to add mood and purpose. If you want us to feel sad, or you want us to feel angry, or you want us to feel urgent, using especially music can affect that. And also sound effects will be helpful in certain cases, depending on what you're trying to do. The third aspect of what we need to talk about is what people read, and that's especially important in documentary films because you're usually giving us information, and we want to be able, in some cases, to see that information. And so there's two things that we might be reading in a documentary film. The first are subtitles and labels, and so those are when you're adding additional information to your images. You might use that if you're doing a document, or if you're doing an interview, then you might label a person. Tell us their name, give us a subtitle or a label for who they are and what their credentials are. You might also give us a glimpse at, a piece of research or something like that. And in that case, you'll want to label it. This would also go with credits and things of that nature. The second type of thing that we'll see and read is probably more common. Oh, sorry. One last thing. Subtitles can help you cite your sources. And that's what I was going to say at the end, but I'll say it now. So a lot of times you can cite your sources simply by adding that label down there, telling us who we're talking to or where the information came from. The second thing is graphics. So this happens a lot in documentary films where you want to show us an image or a chart or a graph, and you want us to understand something. Usually you use a chart or a graph and you don't read it to us so much as show it to us, and then you narrate over it. So as you're narrating to us, we're comparing what you're narrating to us with the information we're getting from the chart or graph. It's also really helpful if you can animate the charts and graphs so that you're putting information up in order. But make sure that I'm going to tell you that the restriction here is that your graphics should be your own. So if you need to make your own chart or graph, it should be something that you have made, not just grabbed off the internet. And if you are going to grab a chart or graph, or especially charts or graphs off the internet, then you need to do so with the permission of the person who created it. You can't just steal it offline. Finally, I want to spend just a minute or so talking about the organization of documentary films. So what I mean by organization in this sense is just how do we put it all together. I'm not telling you about order right now so much as how you can put all the elements together. So the first thing I want to bring up is the sequence. And the sequence, so that would be the order. I'm not going to tell you an order, but the sequence would be the order that you put things in. So how do you decide to order the different film elements that I've just talked about? How do you decide to make sure that all of those are in there in a purposeful way? And you need to think about that. One thing to think about is revealing elements strategically for greater impact. So not telling us something too early or too late, but doing so at the right time. Associating an image with your narration at the right time. All of that is sequence type. Transitions are another thing that you need to consider so that we're taken from one part of your documentary to the next. So make sure that your visual and audio techniques are being used specifically. Sometimes music or a sound effect can be used to get us from one scene to another scene. Sometimes a visual aid such as a wipe, you can wipe between scenes or things like that will often help. And that's exactly what I just talked about. Wiping and dissolving can especially help with transitions. Third, cohesiveness, which means that you have a consistent look and feel to the entire film, that we're not being shoved between two or three different sections of the film that look different or sound different or have an entirely different mood. You want to use especially sound and images to create a consistent feel. I do that on these PowerPoints where I use the same basic color scheme and the same I can't think of the word, the same pattern, I guess that's not the right word, but consistently, so it has a consistent feel throughout also the PowerPoint as well as between the PowerPoints. It'll help your work feel more complete, and it will also help the audience not feel as though we're being kind of jerked around from one thing to the next. Now that we've gone through those, I'd like you, for your reflection, to think about this question. How might these techniques affect the persuasiveness of a film that is presenting an argument? In other words, since your film has to be arguing for something, how can you use the things that I've just talked about to make it more persuasive or less persuasive? Like, how could you misuse them and make your film less persuasive? Think about that, write about it for your reflection, and I will see you with your notes when they're due.